Hello, everyone. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to this Holy Week reflection on Wild Hope by Gayle Boss. We're so grateful to be able to gather with all of you during this time of separation. A recording of today's presentation will be available later on to share with anyone who couldn't join us. And we'll also let you know, of course, how to get your own copy of Gayle's book, Wild Hope. By way of introduction, Gayle Boss is joining us from Michigan, where she writes and where she was born and raised. Her lifelong love of animals and her immersion in spiritual texts and practices have melded in poems and essays that explore how relationships with animals specifically and an attentive presence in the natural world generally restore us to our deepest selves. The mother of 2 grown sons, she lives in Grand Rapids with her husband. Welcome, Gayle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all of you for joining me for a few minutes of Wild Hope this afternoon. I'm honored that you take time out of your Holy Week and from all the preoccupations of this viral time to spend time with me and the animals. All creation groans in this one great act of giving birth. Those are the words that open the book, Wild Hope, Stories for Lent from the Vanishing. They're the words of St. Paul in the letter to the Romans, and they sound oddly prescient, don't they, in this time of COVID-19, especially when we know that COVID-19 likely leapt into the human population from an illegally hunted and trafficked pangolin that was then sold in a live animal market in China. All creation groans. All of us animals are in this together. Paul wrote those words, all creation groans, in this one great act of giving birth. He wrote them to his friends in the winter of the year 58 CE, to his friends in the world's largest city at the time. Rome had probably about 1 million inhabitants. And though we have no record that there was an epidemic in the Roman world at that time, we do know that 100 years later, the Antonine epidemic, or plague as it was called, swept through the Roman world and killed 5 million people, including one of the 2 emperors. At the time that Paul was writing, 58 CE, there was a wildly popular practice that incited huge crowds of people. The politicians, in order to win the hearts and votes of the public, would stage the slaughter of wild animals, tigers, bears, leopards, lions, even elephants, in amphitheaters by gladiators called venatores. For example, the Emperor Titus, to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum, staged what he called 100 days of spectacle, in which 5,000 wild animals, bears, lions, even elephants, were slaughtered. All creation groans in this one great act of giving birth. Now, of course, the Apostle Paul wasn't writing just or even primarily about the gory animal games of his day, but I think he could have and would have pointed to the slaughter of those innocents as one example of what happens when human beings are enslaved to power over others rather than freed into compassion for others. What he later calls the glorious liberty of the children of God. The slaughter of wild innocents in our day isn't as public as it was in St. Paul's day. It's hidden largely, it's often illegal, often lucrative, always easy to overlook. It's more vast and ubiquitous and pernicious by many orders of magnitude than what St. Paul knew. In fact, biologists are now calling the slaughter of wild innocents the sixth mass extinction. And all of the animals that I write about in Wild Hope may be the victims of this mass extinction. I'd like to read the story of one of them, the animal that's given for the reading tomorrow on Monday, Thursday. I want to read the story of the Atlantic bluefin tuna to situate us squarely in the book before we go on for more. So this is the story for Monday, Thursday, the Atlantic bluefin tuna. He began life the size of an eyelash, floating in the warm womb of the Mediterranean Sea. 30 million eggs his mother spilled into the salty tumult. Against the odds, he hatched, he survived. He grew into the natural miracle of his kind, called by many the king, the ultimate fish. Now fully mature, he moves through the enormity of the open Atlantic. His back and flanks variegated blues, belly a silver iridescence, all of him flashed with gold. He is ocean light and flesh. Ocean fluidity too. His is the most hydrodynamic shape on the planet, a streamlined perfection for great boundary crossing migrations. Within as well, he is made for distance travel, high hemoglobin concentration, quick oxygen uptake, and a greater percentage of red muscle fiber than any other fish. For this dense red flesh, there is a grave price on his head. With a small school, he swims north, a translucent window at the top of his head, funneling light to particles that read Earth's magnetic field. Infallible, this guidance system leads the bluefin to waters that can satisfy his muscular hunger. Off the coast of Norway, his superior vision sights mackerel and herring. All but 2 of his 21 fins and finlets drop into neat slots, flawlessly flush with his body, and he rockets through the water 40 miles per hour fast. He eats and grows and eats almost any creature in the sea. For some, he plunges more than half a mile and 60 Fahrenheit degrees below body temperature. His capacity to abide chilling dives or Mediterranean to Scandinavian swims comes from a rete mirabile, a wonderful net of veins and arteries interlaced. In the nets weave blood chilled when frigid water rushes into his gills, quickly heats. In a numb world, he is warm. Warm his mind, his responses are nimble and keen. Come fall, he and his school cross the North Atlantic to forage off Nova Scotia. As the days shorten, they slide south. When the season turns, they turn too, north again, to spots they remember as lush with fish. Simply gliding with the seasons along Atlantic coasts, in 30 years, he could become a 3/4-ton giant. But his life is more than his own. In late spring, he is seized by an irresistible urge to return to the waters where he woke. Rich feeding grounds lose their allure. He and the school set out across the open ocean with a single fierce focus. 2,000 years ago, people stood on promontories to watch bluefin tuna pour through the Straits of Gibraltar. By the millions, the tuna came home to the Mediterranean to spawn. Now one of the world's most overfished species, bluefin are too few to be seen from the highlands. But there are other ways to watch for them. On a calm July morning, a spotter plane circling the sapphire waters off Sicily radios a purse seine boat. "We got tuna." Racing to the location, the boat encircles the school with a conical mile-long net. Crew then begins cinching the net's bottom like a drawstring purse closing around coins. One trapped mind in the water, the tuna spin a clockwise gyre. Except the largest, he darts forward and back, then leaps, terror's rush intensifying his brilliant hues. A tugboat towing an underwater cage draws alongside the imprisoning net. Divers jump in among the fish, open a gate, and herd them into the cage. Fear crazed, the tuna obey. A diver surfaces and signals. One, huge. The boat crew hand him a pistol. By the time they get the big bluefin onto the boat, the light has gone out of his black eyes. 3 red circles bloom between them. Though his silver blue iridescence too has begun to fade, the men standing around him can see themselves mirrored in the sheen of his skin. One stabs his side, releasing a hiss of air and steaming blood. Working quickly, the crew gut him and pack him with ice in a pine box. While the caged tuna will be towed to the coast, transferred to pens, and fattened for months, this exceptional bluefin will be flown to Tokyo and laid on the fish market's auction floor tomorrow morning. The men who live by fishing thump each other. $30,000 for sure. In the pre-dawn dark, the auctioneer rocks and cries numbers in a hypnotic sing-song. Rolling little balls of flesh between their fingers, bidders assess texture and luster. The world's appetite for bluefin sushi and sashimi has been perfected here. It's said the best chefs can taste how afraid the fish was when he died. For a few bites of the finest bluefin belly, their customers will pay hundreds of dollars. Because this flesh is so coveted, those who have built an industry selling it pressure the committee that sets fishing quotas to let them take more and more endangered bluefin from the sea. Whatever number they're allowed, some take more. All told, perhaps double the quota. It was not always so. 5 generations ago, no culture craved bluefin belly. In Japan, if it was eaten at all, it was first buried for days to mellow the flavor. In North America, bluefin inadvertently caught were sold for pet food. Tastes can change. But on this day, the giant caught off Sicily is sold and hauled to a butchering table. The fishmonger cleans the body's long length. He selects a knife from his array. a master of his craft. He painstakingly slices the energy-rich flesh into thin strips, speaking solemnly to what he knows was a great fish. This book, Wild Hope, began to come to me in Advent 2016. All Creation Waits had just been released, and I was wondering what I would write next. All Creation Waits, if you know it, was a book about the overwintering strategies of Northern Hemisphere animals and their spiritual word to us. It was, I think, a book of comfort and solace. As I was wondering what I would be writing next, I kept hearing a word in my prayers. I heard the word suffering, and I knew that the voice speaking that word meant specifically of all the kinds of suffering on earth, meant specifically wild animal suffering. I had been aware that many species are suffering as we humans intrude our lives on theirs, but I really knew only about the most public examples, like elephants being poached for their tusks. Looking back, I think now that I was largely unaware of the extent of wild animal suffering because I didn't want to look at it. I was afraid to look at it. And I didn't look at it until in one photo, it looked out at me and I couldn't look away. I was at my parents' house at Christmas of 2016, and I saw the new issue of National Geographic on a table. I picked it up and I flipped through it and saw that there was a feature story on those great orange apes, orangutans. I began to look at the story and the illustrations, and I saw a photo of 8 baby orangutans in a wheelbarrow, orphans holding to each other. I couldn't look away from the photo. It grabbed my heart. But I also knew that if I kept looking at the photo and if I read the story, I was going to be decidedly un-Christmassy company for my family during Christmas vacation. So I stuffed it at the bottom of the pile of the magazines and I tried to forget about it. But I couldn't forget about it. That photo of the 8 baby orangutans in the wheelbarrow kept swimming into my imagination, especially in off-guard moments like when I was waking up in the morning. So finally, I gave in. I went to the public library. I found the issue of National Geographic, and I read the story. That was in Christmastide. A few days later, I had an email from a woman that I had met once, someone I think is joining us on this conversation today. Maybe Rochelle, I had met you twice. In her email, she said, I'm coming to Grand Rapids on January 5th, 2017. Would you meet me for lunch? We met at a bookstore, and my recollection of it is that before I even had a bite of lunch in my mouth, she handed me an article from Audubon magazine about that amazing little shorebird, imperiled also the red knot. And she said to me, this is what you should write next. This is your next book. She also had the grace to say, I trust your discernment that if this is not what you should write next, you'll know that. But I was taken aback, but I was also compelled. The wave of wild animal suffering between that photo of the baby orangutans and the article Rochelle gave me caught me up. The topmost layers of me still did not want to look at animal suffering, but the deeper layers of me couldn't do anything but look at it, research it, write about it. There was one more card that the Spirit of God pulled, the kind of the coup de grace, to persuade me that this was a project for this time of my life. At the same time that I was hearing the word suffering in my prayers, that I saw the photo of the baby orangutans, and that Rochelle gave me the article on the red knot, I got 2 emails from opposite ends of the country, both strangers to me and to each other, and both asking the same question. They said, Would you consider writing a sequel to All Creation Waits, a sequel for Lent? That was the question of Father Rick Lawler in North Carolina and Heather Young, who was then living in Seattle. At first, I resisted that too. It just seemed so formulaic to me. You know, woman writes animal book for Advent, woman writes animal book for Lent. I didn't want to be that woman. But when my ego got out of the way, I saw that Lent was a perfect time for a book about wild animal suffering. Lent, our English word, comes to us from an Old English word, Lengten, Lencten, that meant in Old English springtime. And Lengten, in turn, came to Old English from the West Germanic language. The word there was langittenas, and it meant lengthening of days. So our English word, Lent, means at its root, the season of lengthening days, springtime. Well, springtime is a season for growing. In the season of lengthening days, things made of earth, including us, our bodies, are meant to grow, both theologically and biologically. We are designed in springtime to thaw, to open, to grow. I think that's why we call spring the season of love. And yes, in the Christian tradition, Lent is a season of penance. Penance because we're asked to come awake, come alive to how cold and constricted our hearts are, and to burst that husk, to grow into larger hearts that have more compassion and more love for all the things of God. I am convinced that only a larger compassion, a greater love for others unlike ourselves, whether it's other classes, races, nations, or species, only a love larger than anything we've ever known is going to pull us back from the brink of our devastation. Facts, arguments, exposés, laws, and policies are not going to do that. They're necessary outgrowths, yes, but they don't seed the change that's necessary. Lasting change will only come when our hearts grow into a larger love, a larger compassion, because over the long haul, we only protect and save what we love. Which begs the question, how do we individually and corporately grow into a larger love for all creation in a Lenten springtime or any time? Well, as Wendell Berry likes to point out, we don't love all creation, or I think as he has it, we don't love a landscape. We love a particular landscape. We love the overgrown meadow that's at the end of my street. We love a particular 40-acre woodlot that the developers blessedly left when they cleared the subdivision. We love a particular creek that's still trying to push through the city. We love the particular. So I thought that maybe one way to help us grow in our love for imperiled creatures would be to tell stories of particular wild creatures, creatures that most of us will never see in the wild. Maybe a book about particular ones of these magnificent animals, a particular orangutan, a particular pangolin, a particular population of mussels, suffering innocently, suffering sacrificially, suffering because of the way we live, which is why Jesus suffers in Holy Week, which is why the Christ suffers daily. Maybe a book of stories about these particular animals suffering innocently would thaw our cold hearts, would thaw and open us to a greater love for these creatures, would help us to see them as expressions of God's own self and of God's own suffering. which is the white hot core of Lent, the suffering of God's beauty. It probably won't surprise you, given all that I've said so far, that the first working title of the book was not Wild Hope. It was All Creation Groans. It seemed a nice follow-on to All Creation Waits, but it was also All Creation Groans because I was certain that if I were to write these stories about wild animal suffering, I was going to come up against unrelenting groaning. Elephants and rhinos with their faces hacked off by machetes, pangolins force-fed the limestone slurry to bloat them so that they bring more per pound to their traffickers, polar bears drowning in seas without ice flows, giant river otters poisoned by the mercury used in gold mining, and on and on. I was certain I was going to hear relentless groaning. What I wasn't certain about was whether I believed St. Paul, who writes, all creation groans in this one great act of giving birth. I wasn't certain that there was any birth, any new life, any hope in all of this groaning. I know Paul says there is. I know that's the core of my faith and the story of Jesus, that in and through the worst suffering, there is a resurrection. But I didn't want to start there. I didn't want to proclaim a cheap joy or the dogma of a certain resurrection if the facts of species extinction didn't warrant it. I wanted to do an honest exploration of the science of extinction to see if all the present suffering indeed was seeded with resurrection. And I think I was prepared to say it is not. The suffering is so grim. Species extinction, the situation is so bleak that there is no new life that we can discern in it. And if God has got a resurrection plan, then God isn't giving any hints about what it's going to look like. And so I was working with the title, All Creation Groans. To my surprise, as I researched species extinction, I did see seeds of hope. Small seeds, to be sure, seeds that are so small, in fact, that unless you get up close, you're not going to see them. Seeds that may not be big enough for some people to count as hope, but small, like, I think, small like the seeds in Jesus's story, small like the seeds of the mustard plant, that though they're the smallest of seeds, grow into shrubs so large that they give rest to all the wandering birds of the air. Before I talk about exactly what that wild hope is that I found and what it looks like and why I think we can have wild hope in the face of the science of species extinction, I thought we could pause here for a few of your questions. Be aware that I will talk about hope and we'll have questions about that at the end. So maybe if you'd like to focus your questions on the things I've talked about so far, that would be most apt. Rachel, you'll moderate those questions?
I sure will. Thank you so much, Gayle. Here's a question from Tracy. She says, we have enjoyed All Creation Waits during Advent for a few years now. Those animals are the ones in your backyard. And yet you wrote about the animals in Wild Hope around the world with the same familiarity. How were those two writing experiences different?
They were quite different, Tracy, and thanks for asking. In fact, that was one of my quandaries as I began Wild Hope. I thought, well, with the muskrat, I can go and sit on the ice and watch him. I really could, I did. And the deer in the field and the fox and the chickadees are right here at my bird feeder. How am I going to write about olms that live at the bottom, 300 feet down at the bottom of lakes, at the bottom of caves in Bosnia-Herzegovina? I had no choice, and I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I could succeed in doing it, but I immersed myself in the stories of these creatures written by other people, both the scientific literature in peer-reviewed journals, but also National Geographic stories and Smithsonian Magazine stories and PBS stories and all those that you can find on the web. That also made it very hard because the internet is a terrible and a wonderful thing, and I could actually watch videos of the black rhino after it had been macheted, spurting blood from the 2 holes in its face and wobbling to try and stand and not succeeding. So it was research that allowed me to do it. I would spend about a month on each animal reading stories about that animal.
Thank you so much. That's a good segue to the next painful question. But Rebecca says, the 3 wounds to the tuna and the searing of his side struck me as the wounds of Christ. Was that intentional in your writing?
Oh yeah, and those aren't the only 2 references. I was very aware. In fact, I specifically chose a fish for Maundy Thursday with the understanding, and those of you who know your Christian history and Christian iconography know that the Christ in the early days of the Christian faith was symbolized by the symbol of a fish among early Christians, a kind of secret sign that they gave each other. So on Maundy Thursday, when Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body broken for you," I wanted to use the symbol of the fish, a fish, and the bluefin tuna was one of those that I could choose from, one of the species that is endangered because we've eaten it up. Yeah, if you go through, Rebecca, I bet you'll find more references like the king of fish, the ultimate fish. Yeah, I'll leave you to find the others.
Gayle, David Richardson says, David Klein's illustrations are as evocative as your text. Could you say a little bit more about them and about him?
Oh, he is magnificent. And hello, David, I'm so glad you're here. He is a master at the woodcut craft, and we worked collaboratively thanks to the generosity of the Paraclete Press editors. That's not generally the way authors and illustrators work, but David and I collaborated. I would send him the text of the animal and say, this is really important that we see this part of the creature. With the bluefin tuna, I really wanted people to see the fins and finlets. They have a distinctive shape, and the curving of his body, that thermodynamic shape that makes him so sleek in the waters. And I would send a few photos, and David would make a sketch and he'd send it back to me and say, what do you think about this? And then I would respond, and I'd say, I think we need a little more torque to the body, or that's perfect, or could the eye be a little bigger, smaller? And he would send me another sketch, and I would send it back with comments. He is wonderfully collaborative, and I'm so grateful to him for that. We worked I'm in Michigan and he's in Brooklyn, so we worked only on email, and I think it worked well.
I'm going to ask our tech friend Dan if he could show that picture of the pangolin for a moment, which you mentioned at the beginning of your reflection, Gayle. That's a story that so many of us haven't been aware of, and a creature that I dare say many of us haven't even been aware of. So I just wanted to give people a chance to look at that beautiful creature there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. If anyone else has questions, please. Oh, here's one. Carol Marsh.
Hi, Carol.
Says, you write both the Advent book and this one from your Christian beliefs and a spirituality rooted in the Bible. Yet I, who no longer consider myself a Christian, am so emotionally and spiritually drawn to these books. I'm really grateful you wrote them to be so inclusive, and wonder if that was a difficult choice for you, or if it comes out of a very broad spirituality.
Thank you, Carol. I'm also glad you're here. I'm glad to know that you find them inclusive. And I heard from Jewish readers too, that they can enter the book. I think, as Richard Rohr says, if it's true here, it's true everywhere. If it's really true, it's true universally. And I hope my Christianity has matured and grown and deepened to that place where I've tapped into, most of the time, I hope, the universality of it without being exclusive. It wasn't a difficult choice. It was just the choice of what I believe and who I hope I am.
Thank you so much. If anyone else has questions, please feel free. Oh, here, Trina Paulus.
Hi,
What
Trina.
a magnificent beauty the two of you produced. She says, David, are those all woodcuts? So David's not here, but
I'll
Gayle
answer
could
for
tell
you.
you. Yes.
Yeah. Trina, so wonderful to have you, and thank you for all that you've done to tell your network about the book. I hope you like the monarch story in this book. Yes, they are. They're all original woodcuts. He starts with a sketch made on the computer, but then he moves to actual woodcuts. I don't know the kind of wood he uses, but maybe I'll ask him and let you know.
Thank you. If anyone else has questions, please feel free. You can use the chat panel or the Q&A panel. But I think those are all the questions we have for now, Gayle.
Sure, then I'd like to spend some time now talking, picking up where I left off, about the wild hope. What is the wild hope of the book? The hope that is hope for wild things, and also that hope that is irrational to us, but not impossible to God, the wild hope. In each particular animal story, there are stories also of particular people who are working to save them, people who love orangutans and olms and pangolins and lemurs and leopards. Every day, these people, who are real, by the way, real people that I've read about in my research, every day, these people devoted to these creatures are working to see what they hope will be a pangolin resurrection, an olm resurrection, an orangutan resurrection. Loving them, they are not only, I think, planting seeds of what they hope will grow into animal species resurrection. I think they're also planting seeds of resurrection in their own lives. They are receiving new possibilities for living for themselves and for the human community. Lives lived differently, lives lived in love for others with no profit for oneself or one's tribe. I now think that the wildest hope in the book is the hope that Paul writes about in the 4th and 5th chapter of Romans, when he says that hope doesn't disappoint us. Hope doesn't put us to shame, because the love of God has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. When human beings are truly graced to live as Jesus did, truly graced to live by and through the love of God, that is, willing to suffer for others for no profit for themselves or for their tribe, then that's when we have a new creation. Human beings willing to suffer for others for no gain. Human beings who live in and from that explosively creative force, the same explosively creative force, love, that was implanted in all things when that great hallelujah shout started the whole universe evolving. When human beings live from that explosive seed, then they can also, as Paul says, share in the glory of God, which is the calling into being the things that are not. That's Romans 4:19. The glory of God is to call into being the things that are not, and human beings who live from that core of love share in that glory, so we can then call into being the things that are not. Like, as the prophet Isaiah foretold, creating that world where we will not hurt or destroy in all God's holy mountain. That, I think, is the wildest hope. And that wild hope is loose in the world. It's most evident in the book, in the story given for Easter of the Taki, also called Przewalski's horse. There were only 12 of them left in the world in the 1950s. And now there are upwards of 3,000, including a herd that's living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, that dead zone created when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor melted down in the mid-1980s. There's a herd of these Taki living and thriving in that zone now. That's just one example of a resurrection story that's happening for other species, because human beings devoted to them in love have called into being the things that are not. There are other species too, probably more than I know of, that you may know of: the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the red-crowned crane, the gray wolf. And yes, at the same time that these species are rebounding and are being restored, hundreds of species are vanishing, some before they've even been scientifically described. In February, for example, scientists declared the bramble K melamus, a rodent sort of animal that lived on one island of Great Barrier Reef. They declared that animal now extinct. It's the first animal that we know of specifically extinguished because of climate change. Rising seas inundated its habitat. And there will never be the throngs of orangutans and pangolins that roamed the earth when my grandparents were young. But since my grandparents were young, there has been a growth, a huge growth in awe for wild creatures. It has swept the globe. I think it's another kind of pandemic, contagion of compassion. For many of us, that contagion isn't spreading fast enough. The seeds of hope are too small to be seen as hope against the principalities and powers that want to destroy gentle apes and other creatures. But those seeds of hope do have at their core that explosive force of love that St. Paul also reminds us is able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we can ask or imagine. I think this would be a good time to take some more questions on the nature of that wild hope, if people have them, or other questions. I can try to answer anything.
Thanks, Gayle. We don't actually have any new questions at this point. Trina Paulus is inviting people to take a look at her new venture in Wild Hope. You can find Trina's information at Hope for the Flowers. She's a kindred spirit with you, Gayle. You mentioned the monarch butterfly.
Right, yeah.
Which is a mutual love of both of yours. But we don't have any more questions. Oh, here's one. Jessica Brown is asking, did you have a favorite animal that you wrote about? One that you fell in love with?
Well, of course, you're going to know that I'm going to say I fell in love with all of them as I researched them. And that's really true. I don't know that I expected to fall in love with salamanders living at the bottom of lakes, at the bottom of caves in Bosnia, but I was just intrigued by them. I will say, though, that there was an episode or a scene in the lives of many of the creatures that undid me more than some of the other episodes or scenes from their lives. And that was when I learned about the ways that mother animals protect their young when faced with death, extinction, like the mother polar bears that are doing everything to try to keep their cubs alive across vast swims when there are no ice floes and the babies can't keep swimming and drowned, or the mother pangolin that curls around her baby when pulled from her den underground, or the lays and albatrosses who watch their babies die from plastic poisoning. As a mother, to watch mothers suffer the kind of suffering that I can't imagine, that was almost more than I could bear in each of the animal portraits. But for all the animals at large, I was just fascinated and in love with all of them.
Thank you so much. Paul Fitch is asking, what do you see as the wild hope that we are to come out of the current pandemic that is currently shaking the whole world?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I am as sunk in this as the rest of you, trying to live through it. I don't have any conclusive answers. I do hope that something that's happening in me is also happening more widely, and that is a kind of sinking down into the joys, the simple, small joys of the day, and being grateful for them. So learning that I don't have to run here, travel there, buy this, buy that, but that I can sit in my driveway in a lawn chair with my neighbors, 6 feet apart, 12 feet apart, and simply talk about the joys of the daffodils and of what's happening to our children, or not to talk about joys, but simply to enjoy each other's company. That will go so far to protecting, I think, our psyches, our spirituality, and our planet, if we don't have to move so fast and have more and more and more, but can learn a kind of inner contentment when we sink into the joy that is in the true self of each of us. I hope that happens.
Thank you. Janice is asking, writing the book, did you do any research involving Indigenous people and their view and connection to the wild creatures?
It did come up in some of the stories. And you know, there was, at most I had 950 words. Thank you, John Sweeney. 950 words for each animal. And there was so little room. I could have gone off and included a great deal more than I did. But for example, to know that the indigenous people of Indonesia think of the orangutan, it's from their language, orangutan, meaning people of the forest, and they see themselves, they see or saw at one time anyway, orangutans as another tribe in their forests. Or the people that thought about the bonobos, maybe this comes across most clearly in the bonobo portrait, where I talk about how the people of that forest in Congo think of the bonobos as helpers to the ancestors. They say, bonobos help us, we help bonobos. They have stories in their literature about bonobos leading lost ones home, or bonobos giving food to villages when villages didn't know how to find it. There are those kinds of stories for virtually all the animals, but I'm afraid that precious little made it into the 950 words allowed for each creature.
I'm thinking about the story about the rhinoceros as well.
Yes, right.
With that man who loved that creature so much. It's
Yes.
a wonderful story. You have to read it if you haven't read Wild Hope. Here's a question from Mayo. How do we bring this wild hope focused on love for the helpless creatures and the planet back to the helpless, poor people nearer to us in cities and towns around the US, around us?
Yeah, I've had that question before, and I really punt it back to those of you who are living in and working in the cities. I don't know the answer to that. I believe, without a lot of first-hand evidence, that even in the most paved cities, there are niches, little corners of creation that if we open our eyes, if we help others open their eyes to them, can lead to a love of other parts of creation. When you have compassion for a caterpillar, you have compassion for a rhinoceros. Compassion is compassion is compassion. And whether it's in the natural world, the non-human world, or in the human world, it just ripples out. So we begin with what we have. I don't have rhinoceroses here, I have muskrats. And I really believe that my compassion for muskrats and chickadees was what allowed me to have compassion for rhinoceroses or olms.
Thank you so much, Gayle. I don't think we have any more questions unless anyone has another Oh, one more. I have a wild hope, someone says, that the vision of sharing that several presidential candidates have brought into consciousness will become clear through our global virus experience and make it a blessing in the long run to heal the earth.
I certainly share that hope, and I believe it's possible. I mean, think how out of the blue this virus came on us, and of course, none of us welcome it. I know people who are at this moment on ventilators. It is difficult, but there are possibilities, friends, that we cannot imagine, that can burst on the world, even through the suffering. And with you, I wait for those.
Carol says, what's hopeful for me, though I've wept at every chapter and during this webinar, is that this book is written and illustrated and published and being read, and that you're helping to usher so many into the spirit and community that is the whole world. Perhaps the awful sorrow I feel about mass extinctions is an opening to greater compassion. Perhaps that's true for many of us.
I surely hope so. Thank you, Carol. I'm also hopeful when I hear from readers how many people are sharing it with children. I think that children are, well, talk about seeds of hope, right? I've heard from people, even here in my block, I can look across the street and see the house where I know that the children who have read about it have raised funds for koalas through bake sales and are sending money to Australia for the rehabilitation of koalas that were injured in the wildfires there. So what a great movement of hope.
Thank you so much, Gayle. I think that's all the questions we have. So is there anything else that you wanted to share?
No, if anybody would like to write to me through my website, I'm happy to hear from you all, and I'll try to tap out a reply. You can pray for what I might write next. I don't know. There might be another Rochelle out there in my life willing to send me something and suggest that that's what I'm to write next.
Thank you so, so much, Gayle. And thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I hope you've seen the links we've been posting in the chat panel, but Gayle's books are available from your local booksellers and, of course, from paracletepress.com. The book Gayle spoke on today, Wild Hope, as well as her book for Advent, All Creation Waits, can be purchased on our website at 20% off today, and free shipping is available this month on orders over $45. Many churches have been able to use these books as group resources for both Advent and Lent. So having heard from Gayle, I'm sure many people will be inspired to investigate further. Also, Paraclete is offering free shipping this month on orders over $45. So please consider gifting this book to friends and family, and your generosity will help support Gayle and Paraclete Press in our ongoing work and providing free webinars such as this one at this time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Gayle.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know if people know that if they enjoyed the reading of Bluefin, Tuna, Paraclete has generously made an audiobook of Wild Hope, and I had so much fun doing it. I'd love for you to hear it. So there's an audiobook of Wild Hope as well as the print book.
Yes, and if you visit the product page on the Paraclete site, the link again is in the comment bar here. It will show you where you can access the physical book, the ebook, and the audiobook. So you'll be able to hear Gayle's voice, and there's a sample on the website too. It was so lovely to hear you read about the tuna again, Gayle. I just love hearing your voice speaking about these creatures. Your love for them comes through so strongly. Someone's asking, will this video will be available later? Yes, it will. There's a link on the Paraclete website. You can watch all of our webinars later. Please feel free to share them with your friends, anyone you know that might like to hear from Gayle directly about the book. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this time together as much as we did, and our prayers are with all of you for health and safety during this time. And we hope you'll join us for more of these times together with our authors. Our calendar of Zoom events is available on our website, paracletepress.com. So God bless you, Gayle, this Holy Week. God bless all of you. We look forward together to the wild hope of Easter.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.